mesdames et messieurs, je pense que nous pouvons commencer. J'ai le grand honneur de vous accueillir chaleureusement à cette séance de notre colloque consacrée au cabinet des curiosités. Tout d'abord, je voudrais remercier cordialement, très cordialement, les organisateurs de m'avoir invité. Je me sens très honoré, mais je me sens aussi un peu gêné parce que mes compétences linguistiques ne sont pas suffisantes. Alors, je suis très désolé, mais je dois abandonner la langue de Victor Hugo, de Voltaire, maintenant. Je me permettrai de donner mon communication et de mener la discussion en anglais. Szanowni Państwo, ladies and gentlemen, let me start with a few introductory remarks. Collecting and Philosophy, Studies on the History of Collecting by Krzysztof Pomian. I would like to open my speech with a personal note, and I hope you will forgive me this. I studied history of art in Poznań. My Master of Arts thesis, supervised by Piotr Piotrowski, was devoted to the works of Anselm Kiefer, a great German contemporary artist. Those of you who have read Piotr Piotrowski's publications are aware of what an excellent, outstanding scholar he was. Piotr was renowned internationally, and there is just a little exaggeration in saying that he actually created the history of modern art of Central and Eastern Europe. Moreover, those of you who are lucky enough to have met him personally know that he had a highly charismatic, magnetic personality. I myself, like many before me and many after me, was under his influence, impressed by his erudition, charm, and indeed, I owe him a lot. After graduating, I won a one-year scholarship in Berlin to investigate post-war German art, in which I was particularly interested then. At that time, I was also reading a lot, including the books I had already known. And that way, I reread the books on collecting by Krzysztof Pomian with more awareness than ever before. Nothing has been the same for me ever since. In 2003, I returned to Poznań to start my PhD studies. However, to Piotr Piotrowski's disappointment, perhaps, my dissertation was not on modern German art, as one would have expected just a few months before. I decided to focus on Silesian collections of the 16th and 18th centuries, cabinets of curiosities, as well as collections of art, natural collections, numismatic collections, and so on and so on. The history of collections would soon become my main object of fascination and research. And I am absolutely positive that if I had not read the books by Krzysztof Pomian, this would never have happened. I'm not sure how many scholars share my story, but I know that Krzysztof Pomian's influence is of great significance. Let's have a look at sheer numbers. Perhaps the most influential of his works on collecting, collectionneurs, amateurs et curieux, first printed by Gallimard in 1987, has been translated into at least 5 languages, and there have been no fewer than 17 editions. Furthermore, there are over 440 hits for the keyword semaphore in the Google Books search engine, almost every one of them relating directly to Krzysztof Pomian. Although those numbers obviously do not tell us much about the significance of Krzysztof Pomian's work on the studies on the history of collecting, yet let's assume that they give us some insight into the extent to which his work has disseminated in the academic world nowadays. To my mind, there are 3 major reasons why Krzysztof Pomian's work is so significant. Firstly, he is the author of a sort of a general theory of collecting, let's call it GTC. Krzysztof Pomian's GTC offers an explanatory rather than descriptive definition of a phenomenon of collecting, as well as a range of operative terms for its analysis, including first and foremost the semaphore Alan Schnapp talked about this morning. In humanities, such gestures are particularly bold because all the models that attempt to generalize cultural phenomena, as well all the attempts to create their taxonomy, which Krzysztof Pomian also did, are inherently risky. Culture is an uncontrollable element, and there will always be individual cases that will not submit to some imposed rule. The task is then to form a flexible concept without changing its fundamentals, which will be possible to change, correct, and expand if need be. I suppose I do not really have to highlight the fact that Krzysztof Pomian's theory fulfills this criterion. Secondly, Krzysztof Pomian presented a range of in-depth, detailed, meticulous studies based on numerous sources, which prove he was right in forming his generalizing assumptions. He fulfilled his own research assumptions while forming them. And finally, my third point is that he himself, my third point is that the ideas included in Pomian's concept define a much broader research field that he himself would have designed and been able and willing to measure. This is why his theory, although constructed 40 years ago, still inspires us today. It is maybe worth highlighting that although Krzysztof Pomian's efforts were highly theoretical, he did not deal with history of collections without names, limited to the analysis of models or descriptions of categories and processes. Quite to the contrary. He writes about real individuals, about real people who have individual characteristics, individual tastes, who are driven by individual goals and desires in their collecting activities. However, those activities take place in strictly defined cultural circumstances and are subjugated to the pressure of huge cultural mechanisms. For Krzysztof Pomian, collecting is first and foremost an important sociological fact, which is both defined by culture and it defines culture. Let us focus now on two major cultural mechanisms which Krzysztof Pomian himself recognizes as especially significant: power and knowledge. The relationship between collecting and power is probably incredible and can be traced back even to the eldest known evidence of proto-collecting in the earliest stages of human civilization. This has to mean that the prestigious and distinctive value is an inherent quality of collecting. It's part and parcel. The result is the cultural phenomenon of collecting by depositories of secular and ecclesiastic power, kings, princes, so on. Yet the phenomenon is socially much broader. Collectors on each step of the social ladder take advantage of the same symbolic capital of collections, each according to their own needs and abilities. Sometimes this element of power is not obviously present in a given collection. It can be hidden under the guise of universalism or objectivity, but tracing its discrete presence became one of the major demands of the so-called new museology. But although Krzysztof Pomian appreciates the importance of the relationship between collecting and power, and even theorizes this topic, he does not spend actually much time discussing it. He acknowledges them and quickly moves on to other issues. This is because his main interest lies elsewhere, in the relationship between collecting and another major cultural force, knowledge. At this point, we need to go back to the beginnings of Krzysztof Pomian's interest in collecting, at least as much as I am able to intuitively reconstruct it, or even to the beginnings of his professional academic interests as such. Krzysztof Pomian, we know it already, but Krzysztof Pomian defended his PhD dissertation in 1965. His thesis was devoted to the birth of modern historiography among French erudites of the 16th and 17th centuries. 3 years later, in 1968, he wrote a book based on this dissertation, Przeszłość jako źródło wiedzy, past as a source of knowledge. Due to, we know this already too, due to political circumstances, the book was published over 30 years after it was submitted. But in this book, Krzysztof Pomian was interested in the development of research procedures by modern historians and the related methodological reflections, as well as social and institutional frameworks for historical studies in the 16th and 17th centuries. While analyzing both the development of research methods and various forms of organizing the academic life, he came across collecting practices. Although acknowledges those findings, they appear sporadically in his work and are actually marginal to the main topic. However, they soon shifted to the center of Krzysztof Pomian's academic interests as he became increasingly fascinating with historical epistemology, question of time, as well as the issue of cultural institutions, archives, museums, and collections. In 1975, he published a paper completely devoted to this topic. An essay in Archiwum Historii Filozofii Myśli Społecznej, Archive of the History of Philosophy and Social Thought. The title, Kolekcjonerstwo i filozofia, Narodziny Nowożytnego Muzeum, Collecting and Philosophy, the Birth of the Modern Museum. The title was devised by the editor, and although it might sound a bit overambitious, indeed it does capture the essence of the problem. The paper analyzes the relationship between collecting and the culture of science, or in a broader sense, the culture of the epoch. In it, Pomian expresses his strong convictions that, I quote, to study collecting is to study a complete culture. It is dealing with the whole culture, end of quote. Collections co-create the cultural image of a given epoch, and vice versa. They reflect the most significant cultural trends of that epoch. The relationship between collecting and knowledge, as opposed to the one between collecting and power, is not obvious. It was not given, it has to be established. It was not done in antiquity nor in the Middle Ages, although both periods are distinguished by their highly developed scientific cultures as well as cultures of collecting. Well, we would have to raise some caveats regarding the Middle Ages here, but let's refrain from it. It was achieved by modern naturalists and humanists. Just as their predecessors, they read, commented on, and collected texts. Yet, they went further in focusing on the sensuality of the experience through watching, touching, smelling, and tasting objects, things. For naturalists and humanists, collections became an element of their research next to the libraries. And this is this element that preoccupied Krzysztof Pomian in the 1970s and later on. Krzysztof Pomian became convinced about the major cultural role of collecting through the analysis of early modern European collections interpreted in the broad context of contemporary currents of thought, as well as some social phenomena. In this early essay mentioned above, he illustrated this problem with a description of the cabinet of curiosities of Father du Molinet, curator of the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, which he copied from a guide to Paris from 1685. This is how a cabinet of natural and artistic curiosities became a sensitive registrant of cultural deviations. In the 1970s, this status was not at all obvious. The available literature on collections of curiosities were rather modest, with die Kunst- und Wunderkammer der Spätrenaissance by Julius von Schlosser from 1908 as the seminal work, remarkable in many ways. It was not until the following decades that groundbreaking publications began to appear, such as The Origins of Museum, the Cabinet of Curiosities in 16th and 17th century Europe, edited by Oliver Impe and Arthur McGregor, 1986, or Collections et collectionneurs dans la France du XVIIe siècle, by Antoine Chaper, 1988. Around the same time, the already mentioned collection of studies by Krzysztof Pomian, Collectionneurs, amateurs et curieux, was published in 1987. Since the 1990s, we have enjoyed a strong and versatile interest in the subject matter, which translates into a great body of excellent research by such scholars as Giuseppe Olmi, Paula Findland, Horst Bredekamp, Laurent Dayston, Andreas Grote, Thomas da Costa Kaufmann, Deborah Meyers, among many others distinguished scholars, some of them present in this very room. The place of collections of curiosities in the system of power and in the academic life of the epoch remained and still remains a significant research question. But there are some new questions inspired by post-colonial studies, studies on economic mechanisms, channels of communication, modern forms of conviviality and hospitality, and so on. But that early decision made by Krzysztof Pomian and few of his colleagues to grant modern collections of curiosities the status of a major cultural phenomenon was decisive. We could imagine a different scenario here. Due to their huge anecdotal potential and visual attractiveness, cabinets of curiosities might as well have been reduced to a whim of pra-scientific minds or being evidence of the imaginary European culture. Although such interpretations are rather uncommon, we can still come across them even today. In fact, those cabinets were a completely serious and major attempt at approaching the challenges of ever-changing reality. Cabinets of curiosities were created where the known world was expanding exponentially, physically through geographical discoveries and virtually through new techniques of getting and spreading information about the world, development of new instruments, print, graphic techniques, and so on. It was the time when people experienced things that their ancestors had never experienced or named. A sort of linguistic crisis made them turn their attention to objects, to things, cabinets of curiosities, that is, objects which were unique and privileged, potentially exceptionally epistemically fertile, were also an attempt at getting control over, organizing, and subjugating the vast amount of new data, an attempt of cataloging and inventorying the world, as Giuseppe Olmi put it in his beautiful essay, L'Inventario del Mondo. Isn't this what their sense is about today? Aren't we being overwhelmed by a similar, if not greater, wave of information, things, and especially images? Historians of culture, including historians of collections and historians of art, are thus facing a huge challenge and a great responsibility. Let's hope that the bureaucratic pressures will, ironically, stem from the same desire to subjugate the surrounding reality, but forcing it into the frameworks of tables and algorithms. So let's hope that this bureaucratic pressure will leave some space for our activity. Thank you very much.